With Professor Helen Thompson, we're looking at the geopolitics of the energy transition. We are at the European University Institute State of the Union 23 conference. Helen, let's start talking about the greatest challenges in the energy transition, both for Europe and globally. What are they?
I think the fundamental one is just how enormous the energy transition is. I think the term energy transition is actually a misnomer. It should be really called, at least what we're aspiring to do, an energy revolution. We're attempting to reinvent the energy basis, essentially, of modern civilization. And once you start thinking about it in those terms, you can see what an extraordinary big commitment that it is. I think that if we then look a little bit more into the specifics, if we leave nuclear power aside, what we're proposing doing or are doing is moving from higher density energy to lower density energy. Again, as you say, we need to leave nuclear power out of that. That doesn't mean that this is an impossible thing to do, but it means that there are, I think, implications that haven't completely been thought through. If you then translate this into a question for Europe, I think the big difficulty for Europe is the fact that, as we know, the energy transition depends on a lot of metals and rare earth minerals, and that Europe is not particularly well endowed with those minerals and metals. And so far as that they are in Europe, most European countries, perhaps I would go as far as to say every European country, has considerable political resistance at the moment to the idea of large-scale metal mining. Europeans would really rather that extraction took place in other parts of the world, but that doesn't mean that other parts of the world want to do that for the benefit of Europeans, particularly those countries which have much lower energy per capita consumption than Europeans enjoy.
Yeah, we'll get back in details to the question of autonomy later on, but we've been looking at some of the challenges. Challenges also mean, of course, opportunities. And what is the main opportunity we have here to actually achieve this revolution you mentioned?
I think that the main opportunity that for European states is it would change something in the historical direction of Europe that's been true since really the age of oil began at the 20th century, which is basically a very high level of foreign energy dependency. If we can do many more things by using electricity, and if we can generate all, in the end, hopefully, of that electricity by low carbon energy, by wind and sun and hydro in some instances, that would be transformative for Europe, because our foreign energy dependency as a continent has caused us mind-boggling difficulties. It's bound up with some of the catastrophes of the 20th century. Now, obviously, we can't be completely foreign resource independent, because that goes back to what we're talking about metals, but it still would be a very significant change and an opportunity, I think, for a different kind of Europe if we weren't so dependent upon the import of foreign energy.
Yeah. You actually mentioned wind, solar and hydrogen, for example. Among those, is there maybe more or less untapped potential for any of those?
Well, I actually meant to say hydro. I don't know whether I said hydro.
Oh, sorry.
I think that the untapped potential really on the hydro, wind and solar side really depends on what European country that we're talking about. For instance, I'm British. We do a lot better with wind than we're going to do with sun. And I think that recognising that these physical realities, if you like, has got to be part of the energy transition. So it makes much more sense to try to scale up British investment or investment in British wind, particularly probably offshore wind, than it does with sun. I think the big unknown is really what work hydrogen can do in this, because the more it is possible for hydrogen to do some of the work that oil in particular has been doing, the less we'll need to electrify, and the less electrification that is needed where transportation is concerned, that's a reduction in the amount of metals that will be required for the energy transition.
Yeah. In this series, we also look at misconceptions about a certain topic. In this case, I would like to ask you actually about the term strategic autonomy. It's talked about a lot these days. The EU should become more autonomous, for example, also in terms of energy. In your work, what kind of misconceptions do you come across?
Well, I think one of them really goes to the way in which energy is more generally misconceived, because I think that once you stop and think about it, you can see quite clearly that energy, fossil fuel energy thus far, and now increasingly low carbon energy as well, is fundamental to modern life. And it's been fundamental, I think, to Europe's history, both in the age of coal and then when oil came into the picture. And one way of telling that story historically would be that European states lost strategic autonomy once the age of oil really took hold, because almost all of them, Austria accepted at the beginning of the 20th century, became dependent upon foreign oil. Now, Britain in particular, but also to some extent France, was successful at constructing an empire around that need, an empire that was then lost. I mean, the British finally withdrew from the Middle East in the early 1970s. So if you look in those energy terms, strategic autonomy would be to get energy autonomy back again, to end foreign energy or substantial foreign energy dependency. And this is where I think then the question that we were talking about earlier comes into play, is that it is possible, I think, to imagine strategic autonomy in energy terms in the sense of importing much less of it and having a very different relationship strategically with the United States as a consequence of that. But we would have to accept, I think, that it's going to involve foreign metal dependency. And then that undercuts the idea of anything like full strategic autonomy. And then we've got to think about the relationship between the energy side of strategic autonomy and the military side of strategic autonomy, because what happened in the 20th century, if it's a story of a loss of strategic autonomy for European countries individually and Europe as a whole, is that those two things went together. That it's not a coincidence that by the middle of the 20th century, the two most powerful militaries in the world, they're obviously the United States, were significantly more powerful with the United States and the Soviet Union. And if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, the two large oil producers in the world were the United States and Russia. So the energy power and the military power, particularly I'd suggest in the United States case, went together. So if we follow that through, strategic autonomy as a coherent project would mean military autonomy, military power exercised independently, particularly of the United States, but it would have to be based on energy autonomy.
I would like to conclude this interview where you started, actually. You know, it's not about energy transition, we need a revolution. Are we well on track for that revolution, or what should happen in terms of policies to make that happen?
I don't think that we're well on track for a revolution. I think that's why we end up talking about a transition, actually, because that's what we're really doing at the moment. And even then, you might say that what we're really doing at the moment is basically adding more energy sources so that we live in a multiple energy world. And I think in terms of doing much more than that, two things are really necessary. One of them is a lot of investment in technological innovation. One of the reasons why we can't really proceed more quickly than, or in a general sense anyway, we can do some micro things more quickly, is because the technologies that we require to do this don't exist yet. We can't store at scale electricity, and until we can do that puts a limit on the ability of solar, wind, hydro to run grids, particularly solar and wind. At the same time, I think we probably need to think much more seriously than we have done about reducing energy consumption, particularly when you look at the timescales that the energy revolution is going to take compared to the timescales of climate change.
Yeah. Professor Helen Thompson, thank you so much for giving us some insights into the world of energy. It was great to have you here.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.